crisis has also given us plenty of opportunities to think how the Eurozone would have been more capable of confronting it if it was able to overcome the asynchronic reactions and to launch the kind of integration that will be able to confront the negative externalities that we have so in so many varied ways witnessed through the crisis. Externalities having to do, for example, with the crisis spreading from one country to another, from one sector to another, and the Eurozone being incapable of confronting a crisis that, if the Eurozone had used the scale economies that it would be able to draw upon, would have been more easily confronted. And I think it is no accident that the mode of governance that has been with us since 2008, 2009, has been what Chancellor Merkel has eloquently called the union method of integration, juxtaposed with the community method of integration. It is a method in which the Commission is rather residual, and most importantly, it is a method in which intergovernmentalism reigns. And it seems to me that the greatest problem that the European Union faces, and the Eurozone, which is clearly evolving into the core project of the European Union, in a sort of pathway of flexible integration, where some will be willing and capable and some are not. The crucial feature of this project is, this process is intergovernmentalism. Now, having said that, intergovernmentalism has achieved very significant acquis of integration in the past. I mean, the Union as a community, and then in all its other steps, has been the product of intergovernmental agreement. But the problem today is that the issue area that we are approaching is one in which such convergence is not anymore feasible, or is not, at least it's not politically easy to achieve. The areas where integration needs to be achieved are areas where national governments have not appeared willing to surrender sovereign control. So there are issue areas, fiscal integration, banking integration, economic integration. If we look at the 4 presidents' report, we can see them there, where one can clearly sense the common interest of the Eurozone, if not for anything more, for overcoming more successfully the crisis. But this common interest is not followed by homogeneity of preferences. And then the second thing I told my students, this was my introduction, is that this integration camp, where externalities and economies of scale impose the further steps towards a closer union, is only achieved where you have homogeneity of preferences. It seems to me that the ability to achieve a common agreement between member states is becoming thinner and thinner as we move on. The national responses that we have seen in various countries, some of which used to be at the core of the integration process. The Netherlands, for example, the Dutch government had run a competence review, and the conclusion was that there are several policies that should be repatriated. Germany is reaching its limits of what it can accept with regard to Eurozone integration, and the South might be talking about greater integration with the Eurozone, but it seems to me that there is a considerable degree of reluctance insofar as communitization of budgetary control is concerned, and a greater say of the Commission with regard to structural policies or how they treat the welfare states. So my conclusion, to run the conclusion, is that this is a situation in which we know that we cannot go back because the costs of going back are enormous. Even the pure project of managing the reversion of all these acquis is inconceivably complicated. We cannot stand where we are because this is clearly an unsustainable equilibrium. But it is very difficult to see how we can move forward, given the very strong national dynamics, and as a result intergovernmental dynamics that have been unleashed over the last few years, and whose results we've come to see in the most deplorable way in the European elections. I'll stop here.
I have one question for both speakers. For Professor Diamandouros, was very interesting this distinction you made between efficiency and democracy. Because I think it took you a long way to describe what is going on. But on this one, I have the following question, because I think we have a problem at another dimension. Democracy at the European Union level is the parliamentary and the executive and how they interact, and the different levels of accountability. The efficiency, in my mind, is the machine, the bureaucracy, how well it works. And you address the issue of the executive of the machine, currently Mr. Juncker and everybody around. How do you balance democracy with accountability? But the thing which was very interesting, and I fully agree. But there is another issue of whose democracy? Who is responsible for the machine? Is it the commissioner or is it the head of state? So there is a much bigger debate to be resolved. Who is the representative democracy above the machine? Is it between the executive and the parliament? There is good discussion. Between the executive and the council, the head of state, I think there is a big debate there. And unless we resolve it, Mr. Juncker will be doing all the right steps, but he will have a friction higher up in the face. And for Mr. Rozakis, I have a much more pragmatic question on the rule of law, which I think it's a part we are not discussing because we feel it has been managed very well, the institutions there. But to which rule of law applies to the Eurogroup? It's a very important body, but it's an informal body, it's an intergovernmental body. So I was actually shocked when I saw the process going on in Cyprus that the Eurogroup made no decision. The Eurogroup used its power to say, you have to decide this, and unless you decide this, you are on your own. And then nobody could question this, you want us to decide. Is it legal? Can we ask the legal division of the Commission to tell us that you want us to apply something legal? Or you go back home and you have to deal with our constitution, you have to deal with our laws, and even worse, we have to be dragged to the European Union courts as having done something illegal that was imposed by the Eurogroup. So to whom is the Eurogroup? Which rule of law applies there? Thanks. Very interesting presentation.
Thank you. And Dr. Nikiforos? Not yet doctor, I hope next year.
Future doctor. It's former doctor.
First of all, I also feel very grateful for having the opportunity to listen at the same time to personalities who, in my mind, have really contributed a lot in the European discourse in this country, a discourse that, let's say, it's not as big and as important as it should be, but at least there are people like you to whom we are grateful. I have a comment related to the two elements that both raised, Mr. Diamandouros and Mr. Rozakis, as well as the comment of Professor Pagulatos a little while ago. It seems that the two axes where our discussion is involved. On the one hand, we have the debate about, let's say, the community and the intergovernmental method as far as how the European Communities Union, the European Union evolved over history. And on the other hand, the state of play today and whether the process of integration has reached its limits, to what Pagulatos mentioned as far as, let's say, we see signs from Germany that doesn't want to go on, Netherlands, and a number of other countries that express. So these are two axes, I would say, of discussion And I would like your comment from both of you as far as whether for these two actions you see, because as Professor Diamandouros, you mentioned, democracy in the European Union was actually introduced 20 years ago, basically through Maastricht. Before that, although a lot of people take as a moment of time the first European elections in 1979, you know, it was more of a show-off of democracy then, rather than content of building up democratic processes and institutions. So we have 20 years, despite naming that European Union is several decades old, democracy is actually 20 years old in the Union. So whether you see that for both these big issues, you know, next steps of integration, as well as the methods, the working methods in the community, whether you see space for European political parties to cover, let's say, the inefficiencies on the one hand, as far as the working method in the Union, but also the policy issues where 28 at the moment member states try to get together and agree on something, because there you have the problem that you have some big players who somehow dominate the discussion and the end result, policy results. While if you had more institutionalized processes, perhaps things could be much better off. And I would like your comment about European political parties. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With Sorry, or would you like us to start? I mean, would you like Judge Rozakis?
Not a comment on the talks of Rozakis or Diamandouros. It is a reply to Zenius. No, this is not correct. They didn't impose anything. Your options there. They didn't give you extra options. What they did there was according to the rules as they existed at that time. These rules were violated in other instances. You mentioned one yesterday in Ireland. The machinery was there, but it did not apply. But this was not something that, you know, your presidency there was asking repeatedly for extra ELA and so on. According to the rules of the European Central Bank, they were not allowed to give any more. Had they violated this rule in the past? Yes, they had.
But the question applies. It's not about Cyprus, it's about somewhere else for you.
I can understand this, but it is not that they violated one particular rule or that they imposed to you this. If you were able, let's say, to raise the corresponding funds from Russia, China, Mars, or I don't know where from, you wouldn't be obliged to follow these instructions that they gave you there. Simply it was something that was fait accompli. That's a different story. It's not a question of legality at all.
If I may ask though, Mr. Tsakloglu, but legally, could they say, okay, thank you, Eurogroup, but I think that my legal rights are not respected here. Could they appeal to the European Court for that decision, legally speaking?
On what? No, I don't think so.
But this was his point.
Okay, let me
hijack decision.
Sorry, this is a very interesting debate. I have also things to say.
The chair is talking. Procedure, please.
Okay, so let's go back to the rule of law we came for that reference. Just Rozakis, thank you. So I have the list here. You'll be the first. If I can kindly ask you to be as brief as possible so that we can accommodate more questions if time allows us to do so. So Professor Bradley will be the first, Dr. Black was the second one, and Professor Yergov the third one. I know, I mean, I'm changing a bit the types, but it's the logic of the army. We are all generals here. So.
Thank you. I have a question for Professor Diamandouros. Thank you for your talk. The question is about the degree to which the drivers of change and the efficiency versus democracy dimension are particular to the EU or more general. And when you talked about the absence of accountability in the early years, you attached that to quite particularly to a French tradition of the 1950s. And just to give one example, I checked my spreadsheet while you were talking, And if you look at UK election manifestos, the first time that the concept of accountability is referred to in those manifestos is in 1970. And they don't appear consistently until 1992. So, you know, the early years are years of a Schumpeterian minimal model of democracy applying across the board, whereas in more recent decades, clearly the pressures towards accountability and transparency and so on are very general as well. So I wonder, I think you're pointing towards the existence of something particular to the EU as well, in addition to that sort of general trend in the nature of democracy. And I wonder if you could pull out a bit further exactly what it is that is particular in the EU.
My question goes to Professor Diamandouros. In what way can a supranational institution like the European Commission can reconcile the two competing forces right now in the EU? The one force is to sustain the EU and keep it on track, namely to monitor the European economies and secure that the European member states will have balanced budget seats, for instance. And the other is how to let's say, address the issue of legitimacy. One repercussion of this 5-year crisis is that in many member states, the citizens perceive that their opinion doesn't matter. When they vote for a government, their political alternative seems to somehow materialize the same regulatory straitjacket crafted in Brussels. So how can a supranational institution, how the new European Commission can reconcile these two competing forces in order to, let's say, secure that public opinion in the EU and the need for more democracy will materialize, and at the same time, the European Commission will continue to work as an efficient mechanism to promote integration?
I have a short question with 2 parts. I will ask both distinguished members you choose to like to reply. The first part of the question I asked it to the former President of the Commission at the State of the Union in Florence this year, Mr. Barroso, and it goes like this. Before the European election, we saw that in member states where traditionally the acceptance rate of the union of the project, like Greece, like the periphery particularly, have been at record time lows, whereas at the same time in the core, particularly Germany, the acceptance rates has been at very, very high levels. So it was a disparity there, obviously linked with the specific measures that the Commission, the Troika in general, has imposed in order to resolve the financial crisis. My question was this to Mr. Barroso. Was that, if you want, disparity, the need to have a high majority, high acceptance rates of in Germany by the population in Germany of the project, Germany being now the engine of the project in many ways, was a price worth paying for losing traditional, if you want, strongholds of support, popular support within the EU, that being the periphery. I will not say what perhaps we could discuss Mr. Barroso's answer. This is the first part. The second part that I didn't ask, you will realize why, was the coincidence of Mr. Barroso's presidency during the crisis. I'm not talking specifically about the dichotomy intergovernmentalism, the equilibrium. I'm referring specifically to the financial crisis, a bliss or a curse, in the sense that if the participation of Germany in particular was necessary, was a weaker personality, at least what I would perceive as a weaker personality, heading the Commission,
accommodating factor for a resolution at some points, as opposed to having a strong dominant personality heading the Commission, perhaps creating some friction between the European Council and the other institutions that were necessary to reach an agreement.
So I would like to cite my prerogative and just one question by Dr. Dinas.
Thanks, Dan.
And this is the last one.
I didn't want to make this fallacy of correlation, but just very quickly a question about the whole issue of accountability. To what extent do you believe that the introduction of elections to the European Parliament have contributed towards this task? And I'm asking this because there's a lot to be said about the importance of the elections per se, of the Parliament also, but the Parliament, we do know that now has increasingly taken more competencies. Still, however, we tend to think of the elections, both domestically and when discussing it more generally, as second-order elections, with all the consequences and the repercussions that this has. And I'm not sure to what extent do you think that there was intervention or in general there was a change that has contributed to the satisfaction of more accountability at the EU level, and also to the extent of which this can change within a specific country. So I just want to give a very quick example. We ran a little experiment at the University of Oxford. We sent emails to all the previous MEPs from students who were actually potential voters of every country. The letter was exactly the same. The only thing the only difference would be whether we would talk about the Barroso government or the national government, of in the national language of every MEP. And we do find that there is hardly any difference in the probability of MEPs replying to these letters, these emails. What is interesting, however, is that the best predictor of whether an MEP replied was whether this MEP had already some experience in the Parliament. It seems that there is some experience, some sort of socialization being made within the Parliament, which is very nice and optimistic, I would say, finding. However, it is something that no one knows really about or no one really discusses. And it seems that at the national level, when elections take place, very different criteria are being used in the selection of the candidates and also in how voters think and choose the candidates themselves.